Welcome to another episode on the Perspicacious Perspective. On this episode, I'll be delving into the controversies surrounding the grooming gang scandal in the UK. I'll be talking about the most notable cases of the so-called grooming gangs, how the UK has responded to the scandal, whether there are any grooming gangs likely to still be in action in the UK, and whether the UK is doing enough to protect young vulnerable people from these infamous gangs. So what are the most infamous cases surrounding the grooming gangs controversy? The most infamous cases surrounding the grooming gang scandal in the UK include the Rotherham inquiry, where at least 1,400 children were abused between 1997 and 2013 in South Yorkshire, the Rochdale inquiry, which lasted between 2008 and 2012 in the Greater Manchester area, Operation Bullfinch, which inquired into grooming gangs in the Oxford area in 2013, the Telford inquiry, which estimated that up to 1,000 girls may have been abused between the 1980s to 2010 in Shropshire, and Operation Tendency, where 20 men were convicted for grooming and sexually abusing underage girls between 2004 and 2011. So let's start with the most notorious case, the Rotherham inquiry. The Rotherham inquiry found that at least 1,400 children had been subjected to sexual exploitation in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. The abuse involved rape, trafficking, threats, physical violence, and extreme emotional manipulation. Some as young as 11 years old had been targeted by groups of men, most of whom were of British Pakistani heritage, who would groom their victims with gifts, alcohol, or drugs before coercing them into sex, often with multiple men. The abuse was sometimes carried out in public places, in cars, and in flats used specifically for exploitation. Rochdale is a part of Greater Manchester, which has a population of over 200,000 people. The Rochdale inquiry came to public attention in 2012, when 9 men, again predominantly of British Pakistani heritage, were convicted for grooming and sexually abusing girls as young as 13 years old. Operation Bullfinch uncovered a pattern of abuse involving a group of men who had systematically targeted vulnerable young girls, some as young as 11, over several years in Oxford. The Telford inquiry exposed an extensive pattern of child sexual exploitation that had persisted in the town of Telford in Shropshire over several decades, which revealed that potentially up to 1,000 girls may have been subjected to horrific abuse, with abuse reportedly dating back to the 1980s and continuing well into the 2010s. And Operation Tendency was a police investigation into a large-scale child sexual exploitation ring operating in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. The operation uncovered the systematic grooming, abuse, and trafficking of underage girls over several years, primarily between 2004 and 2011. 20 men were convicted in 2018 for their roles in the exploitation ring in Huddersfield, receiving long prison sentences, including life terms for some due to Operation Tendency. So how did these gangs form, and why did they target young British girls? Now, it's important to note that the majority of child sex abusers in the UK are white men. With that being said, most of these groomers were of South Asian descent, either first or second generation Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. In the UK, South Asians have a propensity to segregate due to their religion, particularly Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, since they come from Muslim countries. They naturally segregate due to growing up in homes shared with their extended families, so that means aunts, uncles, and grandparents, potentially living with the nuclear family in one home. They grow up in mosques, which is obviously their place of worship, and celebrate Muslim festivals like Eid and Ramadan. They typically eat food from the countries they derive from, which has to be halal, which means permissible, or lawful according to Islamic Sharia law, which by the way actually positively contributes to the British economy, but most importantly, they marry within, as marrying someone who isn't Muslim is forbidden in Islam. So why the grooming gang scandal has caused so much controversy is because it's left white British nationals wondering how the hell Muslims who have settled in the UK perceive non-Muslims. Now, as with every ethnicity, there are bad apples. So while it's easy to generalise Muslims due to some of the practices that may seem discriminatory to British philosophy and progression, from my own personal experience, most Muslims are nothing like the kind who groomed these young girls. But what we can't deny is that these groomers targeted these young, vulnerable British girls because they viewed them as morally inferior because they were not Muslim girls. They knew that these girls were vulnerable, as most of the victims were in the care system or were living unstable lives for their age. That's why the groomers knew they could get away with exploiting the system by organising these rings and luring young, vulnerable British girls with alcohol, drugs, money, gifts, and eventually by threatening and blackmailing them as they passed them through this egregious system. It was only through investigations and reports, particularly the J report on Rotherham, that the public were exposed to what was actually going on. Apparently, complaints were ignored and whistleblowers were silenced due to the fear of the local authorities and the police being labelled as racist. So while taxpayers' money are going to these institutions that are supposed to be protecting the public, or at least the majority of the public, which happens to be white British in the UK, our local authorities and police in the UK are actually cowards. They're only doing what is politically expedient for whatever political agenda exists at the time. And since there are so many large diasporas and communities of South Asians concentrated in particular areas of the UK, British nationals living within those communities have been abandoned, and this is stone cold evidence of this. Think about it. What's the worst thing that could happen to your community in the West? Wouldn't you agree that it would be foreigners settling in your community and then finding out that they've abused the young vulnerable girls living there? That's what's caused this uproar in the UK. What's even more infuriating is that it went on for so long. So even though there's evidence that people were brave enough to make complaints and report these criminals, there were people who have been entrusted to act on the public's behalf who ignored these complaints and reports due to the fear of offending this minority community. To be honest, I can't think of anything worse than how the UK has handled these grooming gangs. It directly relates to the mass migration problem in areas the government obviously perceives as unimportant within the UK. That rather than the government enforcing policies that protect our most vulnerable people, they would instead prefer to circumvent the problem of damaging the relations they have with minority communities in the UK at the expense of young, disengaged female teenagers. If this isn't proof that the UK government doesn't care about the poorer classes in the UK, then I don't know what is. The government in the UK is single-handedly responsible for the issues uncontrolled mass migration has brought about in the UK. They've enabled segregation to the point that migrants in the UK have enough in numbers to organise these sort of heinous crimes. What's even worse is that British locals will inevitably blame the migrant communities. Even though those responsible for the grooming gangs were predominantly Pakistani, it's a misrepresentation of what most Muslim communities are like in the UK. For anyone with any critical thinking capacity, they'll understand very quickly that it's a minority within the minority Muslim community that perpetrated these crimes. The issue really lies with the government. They're the ones who allowed these criminals into the UK. They're the ones who allowed enough migrants to come over to decide they didn't have to integrate. They're the ones who covered up the grooming gang's allegations, and they're the ones who failed to act. So while it's easy for what will be a swath of uneducated British nationals to use Muslim migrants as a scapegoat, it's their own government who allowed immigrants to settle in these working class demographic areas without ensuring that they integrate and without ensuring that their values align with the majority British public. So what does that tell you? It tells me at least that the government is classist. They're willing to execute social experiments on the poorer classes without ensuring that their own British culture is protected. They're willing to lie and cover up their mistakes to protect their own image. Wait, I thought the UK was a democratic country. Does this sound democratic to you? Having a bunch of people who follow a completely different faith, who possess different values than you and the majority of your neighbours? I don't recall a referendum for that. It's funny because whoever was claiming that anyone who didn't support mass migration was racist have ended up eating their words. As I said, the worst thing that could have happened, and the worst of it is that it transpired over a whole 4 decades. So if you've not heard of Tommy Robinson, he's a guy that grew up in a town called Luton, which turned out to be a hotbed for mass Muslim migration. He persevered in attempting to expose these Muslim grooming gangs, and in a 2014 Oxford Union speech, he said, "We have a two-tier police force that treats crimes within the Muslim community differently," and accused the police of facilitating the rape of children for 20 years due to being labelled racist. Now, if you've heard of Tommy Robinson, you'll know how antagonised he is by the government, and maybe his approach to exposing these Muslim grooming gangs is divisive. But it seems odd to me that someone who fought tirelessly to expose the British government's fuck-up is portrayed as a racist and a far-right extremist. I'm sure I've heard of this trick played out before on the public. I mean, if Tommy Robinson wasn't this racist far-right Nazi, then what would he be? Wouldn't he simply be a guy that is attempting to expose the British government of its malfeasance to its own British public? My cynicism leads me to think the latter. It's the old sleight of hand that the political left like to play. Let's label them a far-right extremist so every valid point they raise is nullified. At least that's what it sounds like to me. None of us know enough about Tommy Robinson to prove that he doesn't hold extremist views. What we do know is that Tommy Robinson has always said he isn't racist and that he has Muslim Pakistani friends. His claims that close relatives and friends of his have been targeted and abused by Muslim grooming gangs is credible, but impossible to prove since due to his notoriety, he's left their identities in anonymity. I mean, who are we going to believe? The government, police and local authorities who with painstaking detail attempted to cover up and dissimulate the abuse the vulnerable girls were subjected to in fear of not being labelled racist? Or are we going to believe the guy who doesn't fear being labelled racist to make sure these Muslim grooming gangs are exposed? I know who I believe, anyway. So as it stands, the Greater Manchester Police is currently investigating 1,099 suspects connected to child exploitation involving 715 victims. Since 2019, the Greater Manchester Police has convicted 42 individuals. A national grooming gangs task force set up in April 2023 has led to over 550 arrests and helped identify or protect over 4,000 potential victims across both England and Wales. Operation Lytton in Rochdale, Manchester led to the conviction of 8 men in June this year, 2025, mostly of Asian heritage, for sexually abusing 2 teenage girls over a 5-year span. So it's still going on. There are still grooming gangs in the UK, and there still seems to be controversy over the fact that Pakistani men are disproportionately represented when it comes to convictions. If you in the UK or know anything about the political climate in the UK, then you'll know there's a lot of censorship around what they call hate speech. So there's many politicians and people working in these institutions who are afraid of being labelled racist, which is a problem. Even though Keir Starmer has claimed to launch a full statutory public inquiry into the matter, it seems as though the government's approach to the grooming gang scandal in the UK is reactive rather than proactive. I feel as though the government has neglected the British people for too long, and now it seems like we have a culture which has deteriorated. Even in the last 15 years of my own life, I've noticed that the sense of community in working class areas like Manchester is broken due to uncontrolled mass migration. There seems to be a low bar for entry in the UK, and as you would normally see in other countries whose priority is to retain their culture, there is no requirement for immigrants to integrate into British culture or adopt British values which were once predicated on Christianity, community, liberty, and tolerance. Obviously, the government got too caught up on the tolerance part, and opportunistic people have taken advantage of the UK's lenient approach to immigration. The issues have now seeped deep into British culture to the degree that this dramatic culture shift is now irreversible. Anyone who tries to investigate crimes organised by minority groups is deemed racist, and taxpayers' money is going into the hands of an institution who is scared of calling a spade a spade. What's still to come from this grooming gang scandal is still up in the air, and I'm convinced the more time goes on and the longer these investigations are underway, the more rattled the British public will become to find out that this was happening right under their nose. I'm also sure that the more disturbing the offences are that are committed by these grooming gangs, the more likely the government is in the UK to cover it up under the guise of preventing public disorder. Thanks for listening. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this episode, as there will be more on the way. Peace out.